Good afternoon. We have Vikki Leach, Diversity and Inclusion Director at Zalando, joining us. Hello, Vikki.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi. Good to have you with us. And we have Katherine Conway joining us, Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Aon. Hello, Katherine.
Hi there. Good afternoon. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Wonderful to have you both in this important discussion, because today we want to talk about Chief Inclusion Officers. Who are those people and what role should they really, as opposed to theoretically, play in the organization? Can we start with this very question? Who are Chief Inclusion Officers and what role should they play? Who would like to start?
Okay, well, I'll be delighted to start, and it's good to be here. Thank you. So they're brilliant people, by the way. They're resilient. They have a broad range of skill sets where, that is expected to come with this role. You tend to find people really passionate to the cause that come into the profession and really, really want to, really drive change because a lot of it is about change management.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, they are usually a mix of people. They're not always from an HR or people background. They can be from a business background. They have to be strategic as well as an influencer, but all in all, they have to have a real passion for people.
So it sounds like a quite demanding starting point. Not only do they need to be brilliant, which is enough of an expectation in a job description, not to mention the recruitment process, but they also need to be passionate, generally knowledgeable about the organization. That's quite a lot, and we haven't even started the conversation. Now, the big question, of course, is what if we were to reverse this? What do organizations expect from inclusion officers?
Go on, Vikki, do you want to go?
Thank you. Being too polite here. I think organizations expect a lot of skill sets, a lot of different skill sets. They expect, these great people coming into these very demanding roles to really have a broad range, whether that's analytical skills, presentation skills, being able to deal at every single job level, right up to the board with leadership skills. And of course, budgeting and teams, doing team structuring, anything that really builds up the cause for creating a diversity and inclusion approach and strategy.
I think organizations also expect them to arrive with a magic wand so that they will fix diversity and inclusion. Let's hire a chief inclusion officer and they will magically improve our culture. So I think that there can be unfair expectations on that role, and I think it's very important that the hiring of a chief inclusion officer is done for the right reasons, that the business wants guidance on how to change or how to improve. It can't just be a tick box exercise that it suddenly will make everything better if they hire someone with that role title.
So it's quite normal that organizations have expectations towards their chief inclusion officers, but in this case, is it fair to say that the load of those expectations may prove to be much heavier than young aspiring chief inclusion officers were hoping for initially? Not necessarily young, you never know, but it's a young discipline, formally speaking.
Yeah, I think people coming into the profession, one thing somebody said to me many years ago when I came into the profession, she said it's going to be an emotional roller coaster. Because you do the job because you care, you do the job because you want to see change. So it's very hard to be disconnected from a role like this. But in a way, it's training yourself to try and be disconnected and question, how much do I need to care versus, really staying resilient and sane at the same time, because it is a demanding role.
And what would be the key responsibilities that we can visualize, describe, talk about? Suppose we have an organization hiring a chief inclusion officer, an organization which is not necessarily very experienced in the practicalities of inclusion. What would be those typical responsibilities that you would envision in this role?
I think primarily they do need to be a strategist, so they need to have a clear ability on the strategy that they need to undertake. They need to really get under the skin of an organization to understand what's currently going on. But I think the other roles that they need to play is an influencer. They really need to be able to take people on the journey with them. They need to influence that senior leadership team, as well as actually the top to bottom through the organization. And I think finally, they need to be a challenger. They need to build accountability in others, challenge the status quo, and ensure that there is accountability, that the accountability doesn't just sit with them, but it sits with the whole leadership team and even layers below that too, I think.
So they need to be strategists, they need to be influencers, they also need to be charismatic, and they should probably be good at challenging the organization from the inside. Sounds like a job description for a CEO, doesn't it? Which brings me to the next question. Where should they be positioned within the organization? Does it matter?
I do think it matters, and look, this is my opinion. It's sort of based on my experience as well, and I think we see a lot of these roles in HR. That's a good thing. We see some of these roles out of HR, sitting as a chief diversity officer, reporting into the CEO, and that leveling is really important. Where do you put the role to give you the most gravitas and sponsorship? And freedom of being able to do what the organization needs, because you need to bring in some coaching skills. You need to have a good element of understanding behaviors. As I said, this is around behavior change, and it's around change management.
Katherine, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think where it needs a seat at the table, at the senior table. So again, like Vikki, this is my opinion, but I think reporting into the CEO or definitely into the senior leadership team is super important, because then they have the credibility, they have the ability to influence right at the top of the organization. And it needs to send a signal to the whole organization how important this role is and how committed the organization is to driving change.
So to reverse this logic, would it be fair to say that if you're looking for a job as chief inclusion officer, you found a company which wants to hire one, but at the end of the day you discover that they put you somewhere low in the organization, does it send the signal back to you saying that they don't know what they're talking about?
No, not really. I mean, it's good. Number one, it's good that they've recognised that there is a need for this type of role. It's quite surprising how many organisations still don't have chief inclusion officers. But I think with any role, if you're put at a job level without the gravitas and the sponsorship, it's just going to be hard.
Fair enough. Any other comments on that?
No, I'd say exactly the same. It just makes it harder. Good. Because your influence is less. So, I think if you saw a role, you would probably challenge that reporting line, and you'd want to understand more about how you could influence the top layer from a couple of layers down, if that's where you sit.
What would be the most likely obstacles that chief inclusion officer should expect when trying to perform the ideal role, so to say?
For me, it's definitely the sponsorship as an obstacle. You've got to be really clear, who's got my back, who's going to support me when I am going to drive this change in the organisation where, some leaders, some employees may resist to change. So who can I go to help remove those blockers? And that's so important.
Vikki,
Yeah,
the timing couldn't be... Yeah, yes, Katherine, please.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, I think it's that you're pushing people out of their comfort zone. So you have to be prepared that not everyone, will understand what you're trying to get them to do. So I think it's you have to be really resilient. And that point that Vikki made about somebody having your back is critical.
Vikki, the timing couldn't be really better for you in a sense. Correct me if I'm wrong, but your book is coming out this week. It's Financial Times Guide to Inclusion and Diversity, and I believe, I would imagine there's a reason why you put inclusion ahead of diversity in the title of the book.
Yeah, I did. It's a discussion that's been on the table for many years, and I've actually put the B before the I before the D because I just think the B around behaviours. We've got to look at our own behaviours. How does your behaviour impact others before we can really think how inclusive are we? Before we can even embrace the diversity around us. So the book talks about that. And also I've attributed the book to D&I practitioners because, there's practical tips and techniques in there, but, I just don't think the profession is supported enough. So hence I've attributed the book to the profession.
All right, we've got two questions coming from our audience. Antoni is asking, I can see D&I managers as change makers inside the company, but also as an ambassador for your company brand, etc. Some of them are really well recognized. What kind of balance should we practice between being a manager and business celebrity? Interesting question.
That's a great question.
Speaking of people who publish books.
That's a great question. And actually, I think D&I managers, there is some work that we need to do on advertising our organisations as a diverse and inclusive place to work. So we want to make sure that we are an employer of choice. But I can see, and I have seen, people enjoying, the external sort of work. But I'm always super conscious of not talking about something externally until I think we've really got it right internally. I think there's a very fine
enjoying the external
there.
sort of work, which is a nice synonym to spotlight. All right. Yes, Vikki, you wanted to comment on this?
I think there's. I agree with Katherine. There's a lot to do internally before going out externally. But there's also that point around, going out there and being humble to say we, as an organisation, we've still got a lot to do, and that work will never stop because of this emotional roller coaster. I do think there's a really strong case to bring everything that we do back to the organization's values or behaviours which are in place, which may allude to inclusion and diversity. So it gives you a little bit more power as well to sort of link it back to other values set around the organisation.
Vikki, Katherine, the next two questions and the last two questions are interlinked, so I will read one after another, and they're also beautifully linked to what you've just said. Anna is asking, is it better to hire from outside or to search for somebody already being part of the organization? And related to this comes a question from Ekaterina. How could we actually develop a person internally for taking this role?
Yeah, I don't think there's better. It's about what the organisation is looking for. I know people take this role who don't have experience in inclusion and diversity, but they will have some other experience to help drive the change that the organisation needs. So it really is the kind of skill sets you're looking for, and again, just looking for the right person who will deliver what you need them to deliver.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there's no magic solution. I think it's helpful for people to have an understanding of the organization, because it does take time to understand what's going on in terms of culture around the organization, especially if it's a large global organization, to work that out. But also sometimes it's fantastic to get fresh, innovative perspectives from outside. And I think in terms of developing someone from within, I think the strategic vision, making sure it links in with the business vision, make sure it links in with the culture and values and purpose of an organization, is really important. So I think as long as someone has the people skills, but also that strategic business vision, I think would be the key development areas for me.
What are the most common mistakes that people make in this role? What would you say? Because as we discussed just prior to this conference, this meeting of ours, in our earlier discussion, we talked about that it's really a difficult place to be in right now, especially for inclusion officers, often perceived as a very independent role, as opposed to roles which have traditionally teams to rely on, communities to rely on. On top of that, you have this pace of change and shifts. People, it's also much more personal in the sense that with inclusion officers, people tend to come to you with very personal stories. So what would be the key mistakes that people make?
I don't know if it's a mistake, but I can certainly just talk about my experience and learnings along the way. I do feel that we come in. This is such a unique role. We come into it with our passion, and we come into it because we want to see change, and we want a fairer, more level playing field, if you like. And what goes with that is people coming to you, sharing those personal stories, and my goodness, it can really, trigger your own. Personal thinking and distresses in a way. So again, I go back to this: how do you stay disconnected and drive a D&I strategy that is going to really change the organization to become more inclusive? And how do you do that as an individual? Because at the end of the day, you are also a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I ask you for a closing remark for this entire huge topic? We've learned it's a very sophisticated role that in itself is a challenge. Katherine, would you like to close this topic with one sentence that you would like all of us to remember from this discussion?
Okay, I think that you should make sure in this role that you are encouraging personal accountability for inclusion from from the rest of the organization, right from senior leadership. And I would say don't take that personal accountability yourself. Make it clear that you are not the one that's going to fix this, and that every single person in the organization needs to be a chief inclusion officer as well as you, because only by giving people that personal accountability and making sure that they take that responsibility will you drive change.
And this is a strategic exercise in its own right, I would imagine. Vikki?
Yeah, that's lovely, really lovely, Katherine. To add to that, challenge the status quo, go for high impact and do a few things well that will give you that high impact that organizations will be able to see that you've shifted the needle.
Well, the fact that you challenge the status quo alone makes you possibly the candidate for the most annoying person in the company. That in itself is an encouragement. Vikki Leach, Diversity and Inclusion Director, Zalando. Katherine Conway, Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Aon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thank you.